Hi, listeners. Today's episode features an amazing conversation with Elaine Lin Hering, and we're celebrating with a special book giveaway. You can win a copy of her book, Unlearning Silence: How to Speak Your Mind, Unleash Talent, and Live More Fully. For details, head over to LinkedIn or to our Instagram at Resa Lewis MD. Don't miss out. Good luck. Now let's get to the episode.
The difference between silence that is additive or silence that is oppressive is agency. Do I get to choose when I want to say something, whether I want to stay silent, or do I feel like that's my only choice? Because again, the costs of actually saying something, using my voice, revealing who I am, bringing my expertise to the table is too costly.
This is the Visible Voices podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Resa E. Lewis. In today's conversation, I'm speaking with Elaine Lin Hering. Elaine is a facilitator, a speaker, an award-winning, best-selling book author of the book named Unlearning Silence, and a lawyer. She works with organizations and individuals to build skills in communication, collaboration, and conflict management. She's worked on 6 continents with a wide range of government, corporate, and nonprofit clients. Formerly, she was a managing partner of Triad Consulting Group and a lecturer on law at Harvard Law School. Elaine came across my radar because of, the world of author and writing. She and I quickly had a conversation that connected us. The concepts and the content of her book, Unlearning Silence, very much overlaps some of the topics we cover here on the Visible Voices. Let's get to the conversation. I want to jump right in, and today we're going to focus on your book. How are you different having written this book?
I actually believe I have a voice.
Whereas before,
I wasn't sure I did. And some of that is I grew up professionally teaching someone else's content, channeling someone else's thoughts, even to the point of matching my intonation and enunciation to the way they spoke. And a client remarked on it at one point. And I thought my value in the world came from propagating someone else's ideas rather than having my own or having my own insights, experiences, perspectives be of value. And writing this book was I guess I have something to say. Oh, I think it's resonating. I might actually have a voice.
What you shared very much resonates with me because I talk about academics and academic medicine, and I knew I was brainwashed, but I was deeply, deeply brainwashed. Mm-hmm. And the achievements, the ambitions, the tick-off steps of accomplishment were very much defined by others, people, as well as the institution.
Absolutely. All the shoulds of the world rather than who are you or what do you bring, and what's the line between brainwashing and education.
What strikes me about the read, and I very much loved this read, and it's not by chance that the title of your book is Unlearning Silence: How to Speak Your Mind, Unleash Talent, and Live More Fully, very much aligns with the title of this podcast, The Visible Voices. What strikes me is your book is not just about an individual. It's more about, sure, individuals, but group think, group speak, and also the people leading these groups, i.e. leaders and leadership.
Absolutely. So often the problem statement around finding your voice, using your voice is focused on the individual. And while that's important, silence operates at least on 3 levels. First, the ways I've learned and benefited from silence, the ways that even well-intentioned leaders around me continue to silence me, even as they say, I'm here to support you, my door is always open. And then collectively, what sort of culture on the team or organization are we building? Are we building a culture of silence, of which groupthink is a symptom? Or are we building a culture of voice where people don't feel the need to edit, are more able to ideate, to really collaborate, to innovate, to spend the energy doing that sort of generative work rather than stepping on eggshells, tiptoeing, spending the energy editing to just try to save your spot at the table?
Yeah. Which is deeply injurious. I want to use that word right there, injurious. It's actually toxic. It's unhealthy to be in those workplaces. And this is from the book. If silence breeds silence, voice can also breed voice.
Absolutely. We very much look around at the people around us, particularly if we're new or more junior, to say, how do things work around here? And researchers have long termed this employee silence or organizational silence. The more we look around and don't see other people speaking up, that behavior being rewarded, the more we conclude, I guess we don't do that around here. We just comply. Whatever the leader says goes, even as they say they're open to feedback. And of course, there are different data points that contribute to our conclusions around whether it actually makes sense to stay silent or use our voice. And if we see that other people are offering a different perspective that is actually well received, rewarded, then we're also more inspired or likely to use our own voices.
Yeah. I think very much in the workplace, we're always assessing safety, psychological safety. And a marker of that safety is the freedom or lack of freedom to use one's voice. I really liked the way you described actually two sides of silence. Number one, silence can be self-care. Mm-hmm. And then also it can be a reaction to feeling psychologically unsafe.
You cannot experience psychological safety if you feel silenced or are silenced. Rich, there's a slight nuanced difference there of I might feel silenced because of the deeply ingrained patterns of my life and experiences over time, and I didn't make it up. Those dynamics are there. Our intuition is often wiser than we give it credit for. And also, do I want to take the risk right now? Can I expose myself to potentially injurious behavior? What can I stomach? Those are all questions that are split-second calculations that often incline us towards silence because that seems safer in the short term, even if it does damage in the longer term.
Silence is self-care. I'd like to go a little deeper on that. I actually love silence. I love quiet. I love the quiet of the early hours when it's dark out and no one is up, the world is asleep. I love silence at the end of an emergency department shift, I think actually as a reaction to all of the noise and all of the stimulation. So can you talk a little bit more about when silence is self-care?
Yeah, I want to be really clear, even as we're talking about silence, to define our terms. And that's maybe my legal background coming out there. The silence you described that is generative, that is necessary for meditation, for clarity, for health, is not the silence I'm talking about unlearning. In fact, I think we would all benefit if we had more of that intentional, agenic silence, right? The quiet of the morning, the pause between stimulus and response. The silence I'm talking about is when there's not enough room in the conversation or the ecosystem for your thoughts, preferences, priorities, when you can't actually say what you're thinking because the costs are too high, where you have to edit out parts of yourselves because those parts don't seem welcome. That's the silence I'm talking about. And silence as self-care, the difference between silence that is additive or silence that is oppressive is agency. Do I get to choose when I want to say something, whether I want to stay silent, or do I feel like that's my only choice? Because again, the costs of actually saying something, using my voice, revealing who I am, bringing my expertise to the table is too costly.
I appreciate and love that you clarified that difference. And also, continuing on the silence, I'm curious if you could share an experience you have had where you have been silenced and one where you have actually been the silencer, silenced someone.
I mean, I open the book with a vignette that too many of us have experienced, which is you have poured your heart, soul, effort, bandwidth into work, and then someone else takes credit for it. And no one else at the table, including yourself, says anything about it. And that takes us back to what norms, what operating norms did we grow up with, that hard work might be recognized and rewarded, that you shouldn't push back to your elders or people more senior than you, that work would speak for itself, all of those different aspects. Was I silenced? Was I too grabby? Do I need to get credit? All of that self-doubt comes into play. Should I even say something? Would it matter? That to me is an instance where I was silenced in that I didn't speak up for myself. It also didn't seem like the system could bear it, because then I would be selfish. I would be self-centered, all of these pieces, versus we're part of an ecosystem where credit is given where credit is due. If you're the one who came up with the idea, we'll attribute it to you.
Was it an idea? Was it a written paper? Was it a presentation?
It was an idea that turned into a presentation, right? I describe it as I was the one who synthesized all of those pages of notes, conducted the interviews into those 3 bullet points that then get presented. And sure, there is a chain of command, and I may not be the one presenting the ideas, but would you at least say this was a team effort versus erasing my contribution and taking the accomplishment for yourself? Now, I'm also aware that as a human being, I end up silencing other people, not just my child. When I'm a tired parent and I really just want you to go to sleep, so would you just shut it? Again, in the book, I describe an instance where a colleague who at the time was more junior to me said, I don't understand how our firm is diverse and inclusive. And this was on email. I was walking home from the grocery store. I put the grocery bags down and I had on my smartphone, my thumbs went at it and said, I can think of at least 10 ways that we're diverse and inclusive. Let's talk about it on the next call. And I can replay that moment and come up with all the reasoning for why I did what I did. But the reality is, in the moment, I shut down the conversation. I wasn't focusing on the issue that she had raised. I wasn't curious as to her perspective. The impact that I had on her was to silence and dismiss her, not because that's what I intended to do. And it gives me deep compassion for the challenge we're all navigating of how do we share who we are, our thoughts, our insights, our gifts. How do we make space, create space for others to do that as well? As we butt up against one another, what do we do about it? And to know that none of us are going to get it right 100% of the time, which is why that next step, what are you going to do next? Are you going to own it? Are you going to circle back? Whatever the language you have, but what's your next move around it? Because each action and interaction impacts the culture and the norms that we're co-creating.
What is the follow-up to that story? What happened?
It took me about 3 years, but I finally apologized to her and said, hey, I don't know if you remember this interaction. And of course she did. And I said, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I did not show up well in that moment. I am sorry for shutting you down. I'm sorry for not seeing it, seeing the impact more clearly earlier. And I wish I had shown up differently. And she said, I really appreciate that. Apology accepted. It was such a healthy reminder to me that, it's not like you miss your shot. I messed up in the moment. As a leader, how am I going to show up in the next moment? I hope next time something like that happens, because it will. Despite my best intention and effort, I own it, that it doesn't take me 3 years to own. I'm getting better at that. Maybe it's a couple of days. Maybe it's 24 hours. Maybe it's 15 minutes after we hang up the call of, hold on, I'm replaying that. That was not my finest moment. I'm sorry. Can we do a redo?
When I speak about the visible voices, I ask guests, when did you realize you had a voice? And when did you start using your voice? And I pose those 2 questions because many guests share that they had a voice and they lost it at some point.
Yes.
And then they refound it. They couldn't stay silent anymore. And I'm wondering how you resonate with those 2 questions and what is your response? When did you realize you had a voice? When did you start using your voice?
I started using my voice before I realized I had a voice, which actually is an interesting takeaway. I've started using my voice when I realized the problem statement as it's presented, meaning if you're not getting heard, you need to speak up. You need to have more courage. You need to have more confidence, essentially some version of go fix yourself. That was the advice I received. And it was the advice that I'm sorry to say that I gave out for many years. And I stepped back to think, hold on, something's missing here, because you need to speak up is part of the equation. But if I speak up and I am reprimanded, I am beat down for it, literally or figuratively, it's not about more courage. It's not about more confidence. That is insufficient. And so it is irresponsible to continue to use that framing. So I made the connection to silence, which to me is more accurate. In what ways have I learned silence? In what ways do I silence the people around me? And in what ways is silence baked into the systems we're all part of? Can we have more intellectual honesty around the situation? Answering the right question increases the likelihood we can actually affect change. So I started using my voice, experimenting with that frame before I realized I had a voice, because writing this book, honestly, was a meta level unlearning my own silence.
You are the other side of writing this book. It's out in the world and you realize you have a voice. What now is keeping you up at night?
The world, because it can feel really overwhelming, whether it is geopolitics, whether it is capitalism, whether it is the hypocrisy that we see in our leaders and organizations, the practices that are unspoken. It can feel incredibly overwhelming. And at the same time, I also know that each of us answering the right question, being honest about our own contributions to a conversational, relational, systemic dynamic, being conscious of our contribution means that we can actually choose a different way to bring ourselves more in alignment with the leaders we say we want to be, to create the workplaces and teams that we say we want, and that research shows us has better outcomes. And that choice gives me hope.
Yeah. For audience members who are thinking both sides of this, is there one thing you can advise on how they can find their voice if they feel that they are silent, have been silenced? And I'll flip the other side for people that want to recognize, discern, am I one of those people that silences in the workplace? What would be a clue in that they are one of those silencers?
If you are looking to re-nurture your voice, meaning we were all born with a voice and that somewhere along the way you lost it, I would say you learned silenced or were silenced. I would start with some internal work, which is as you're listening to a podcast, listening to the news, sitting in a meeting, to ask 2 questions. Number 1, what do I think? Number 2, what do I need? Because both of those things remind us that there is a me, there is a something inside. I have thoughts, feelings of my own. By the way, it's not what does your manager think, not what does the company want you to think, not what does your mother want you to think. It is what do I think? And that reawakens this sense that I do have a voice. And then it becomes hard not to beg the question when and where and with whom might I want to share that perspective. On the flip side, how might I know that I'm silencing someone? There's 2 different ways. One would be a cheeky answer, which is look at chapters 5 and 9 of my book. Chapter 5 is how we silence other people. There's 9 different ways that we tend to do it. Micro actions, macro actions. And then chapter 9 is the how-to guide of how to stop silencing people. There are a couple of symptoms I would look at, though. Is there groupthink on your team? Meaning no one's willing to publicly or privately challenge you. And is there a meeting after the meeting where during the meeting you hear one thing, but the real work happens after the fact? Those are 2 symptoms that give me clues that there's silence at play here. And also, for me, fairly easy or simple, even though we know that simple and easy are not always synonymous, shifts, meaning instead of asking someone to speak up or play devil's advocate, to embed standard questions into the way that you work. So again, instead of assuming that if someone had something to say, they would say it or that they would push back, but that your agenda items as you're evaluating an issue are literally, What are the pros of this idea? What are the cons of this idea? Or what about this works? What about this doesn't work? What resonates? What concerns? That those are agenda items. So we're asking standard questions rather than someone needing to muster up the gumption, take the risk or the courage to push back on you and not know how it's going to land, or when the right moment is to say that, versus, all right, here we go again. We all know these are the questions we ask and answer all the time together as a team. Changing the way that we interact by embedding those standard questions gets you around the groupthink more effectively.
Yeah. Culture change is slow. Institutions are bigger than we are as individuals. And I, like you, believe in individual agency and providing the how-to, providing those tools for people to have hope and feel that they can make change when sometimes things don't feel as such. As a final question, what would you like your legacy to be? What is your legacy now, and what is it going forward with this book?
I hope that my legacy is one of seeing people as people and creating spaces where human beings can thrive. And that means that we actually are aware of who we are, the perspectives, experiences, insights we bring, and that there's space for all of that. I don't have to edit out myself in order to be accepted by you or in conversation with you, not because we see eye to eye about all of it, but because it is in the differences that we find richness. Differences that is the fabric that we live in color rather than on grayscale. I hope that's the legacy of us all being more whole as humans.
The Resa wrap-up. Special thanks to Elaine Lin Hering for joining me in conversation. It was a delight to go granular with her book, Unlearning Silence. Now, audience, I want you to ask yourself, have you ever been silenced? Mostly professionally, sure personally, but what we're talking about here is in the workplace. And not only have you potentially been silenced, but have you flipped the script? Ever silenced anybody? Here are 3 ways that you can be sure that you're being cognizant, conscious, and aware of whether or not you're creating inclusive environments so as to not silence other people in the workplace. Number 1, create inclusive spaces for dialogue. Actively invite input from everybody on your team, especially those who might be less likely to speak up. For example, you can pause and ask a quieter team member for their thoughts. Number 2, acknowledge and validate contributions from everyone. Be sure to show appreciation for others' input, even if you don't agree. What does this do? This actually reinforces that everyone's perspective is valued, and it encourages future participation. And finally, be mindful of power dynamics. Recognize how power, status, and/or authority can affect who actually feels comfortable speaking up, using their voice, and being visible. That's all I have for you this week, audience. See you next time. The Visible Voices podcast amplifies voices in the healthcare, equity, and current trends spaces. We are a production of the People's Media Network. Our team includes Dr. Giuliano DePortu and me, Dr. Resa E. Lewis. Please find me through my website and on social media, Resa E. Lewis, MD, or through the podcast, thevisiblevoicespodcast.com. Please give us a 5-star rating on Apple or wherever you listen to podcasts. Also, please be sure to share the show with a friend. The views and opinions expressed by the host and guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the opinion of the institution with which they are affiliated or identified. Information herein should never be used as a substitute for clinical judgment or for medical advice.